First world, green engineering, ganja smoking, laid back, peace-loving, and Europe's tallest people.
What you gonna do? Then I was gone and gone and gone, gone and gone. The high don't stop till there's nothing to pawn, and I was gone and gone.
And the best national team never to have won the World Cup. Except for the World Cup part. Not a bad set of stereotypes to have if you had to pick some. But if this was the 1600s, Netherlands would have been a permanent member on the UN Security Council with veto power and a military presence all over the world. Yes, this small country that comes in at number 131 on the world's largest countries had this kind of sway just over 400 years ago.
Guilds have a monopoly on trade and set the prices.
In this period in the 17th century, there was a huge influx of wealth coming from the increased trade, and the Netherlands was really the center for trade for much of the rest of Europe. And so people were starting to rise to a new class, a merchant class. So showing your wealth was a way of showing that you had arrived in society.
I see you are working your usual magic this evening.
Instead, the current reality is this. Netherlands is now a second-rate military power whose government is limited to leading the world in commercial enterprises and world-class civil engineering projects. Ouch. Oh, despair ye how the mighty have fallen. Even politically, the Netherlands isn't known for headlining in Europe. But with the latest parliamentary elections, they seem to have changed trajectory. Recent voting has shown them drifting away from their open society reputation to more aggressive, right-leaning leadership, with anti-immigration and anti-Muslim rhetoric becoming the focus point. After the latest election results, observers have increasingly questioned the future relevance of the European Union, as Europeans are now voting for closed and national rather than open and continental-oriented political parties in elections. Think about it. If EU founding members, such as the Netherlands, are beginning to contemplate leaving the EU like Britain, this questioning is becoming more fundamental than speculative.
6 months in the making. A government coalition for the Netherlands, led by the far-right leader Geert Wilders, who promised to stay true to his party's hard line on immigration and to opt out of the EU's new asylum system, even if it took years to do.
So we first use the Dutch law and the crisis law we have to make sure that there will be less influx of asylum seekers in the Netherlands. And that is something that we don't need the European Union for. That is totally compatible with European law.
Wilders said the Netherlands planned to follow in the footsteps of Denmark, which negotiated a deal to be excluded from the EU's asylum policies. But an EU spokesperson appeared to pour cold water on that idea, but added he would wait to hear exactly what the Dutch government had in mind.
You cannot opt out of EU legislation. In the past, when certain discussions were taking place on treaties, certain countries, in the context of those discussions, negotiated opt-outs. But we are working on the basis of existing treaties.
The EU's pact on migration and asylum includes tougher borders and shared responsibility among the bloc's members to take in asylum seekers. The new rules come into effect in 2026, and the deal's passage comes ahead of Europe-wide elections next month, in which immigration is playing a major role. Meanwhile, as Dutch politicians outline the government's new policies, it still remains to be seen who will be Prime Minister of the EU's fifth largest economy. Prime Minister Mark Rutte is retiring from national politics and is expected to be tapped as the new NATO Secretary General. Wilders himself has shelved his ambitions to be PM amid widespread unease over his anti-Islam and anti-European views.
With global immigration becoming a reality for most native populations, this pattern has naturally resulted in uncomfortable shifts in demographics for some traditionalists. Historically, though, the Dutch aren't in new territory. In fact, for some native Dutch, they may very well be repeating their historical fight for nationhood as they distance themselves from the European Union. See, despite most of the country being atheists, religion seems to be a soft spot for the Dutch. The recent rise of Islam has become one of the most divisive issues in the nation's demographics. In the past, though, the battle of faiths was between the Catholics and Protestants. Today's atheists aren't persecuted in the Netherlands and have been growing in numbers. But in 15th century Europe, it was suicidal to declare such a belief publicly. 'Cause European governments back then were serious about their version of Christianity, to the point that recent pontiffs have apologized for some of the wrongs committed by their forerunners. But at the same time, rightly claimed to be the main reason why the Christian faith has spread globally. While most countries can point at opposition to resource exploitation by foreign governments as the rallying point for nationhood, for the Dutch it was religious fundamentalism. More specifically, anti-Catholicism. The area we now call the Netherlands started as a marshy area settlement that had man-made dams. As the settlement grew in importance and became a city, it became a conquest in the 1400s of a nobleman called Philip and ultimately fell under the realm of the Austrian Habsburgs and the French via the House of Valois. They remained rulers for some 150 years, with Catholicism being the endorsed branch of Christianity. However, as many Dutch began to identify themselves with the Protestant Reformation, started by Martin Luther, conflict with the pro-Catholic government escalated into total war until 1648, resulting in the country's independence and the recognition of the Dutch Republic. The next century would see the Dutch culture and trade spread globally, with some historians referring to this period as the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch began to establish trading posts and expand their cultural, economic, and military power to the Americas, Asia, and Africa, controlling the sea routes to highly valued commodities such as spice, sugar, and, sadly, slaves. This rapid spread of Dutch culture is still evidenced today with the Boer people of South Africa, who are descendants of Dutch settlers during this period. Furthermore, the Afrikaans language, which is a modest variation of the Dutch language, is readily spoken in both Namibia and South Africa. The language serves as cultural residue of a time when the small country was a superpower and punched way above its weight class globally. To this day, the Dutch generation of the 1600s remain the most celebrated triumphs of its rulers. After the 1700s, Dutch power assumed a status that is more recognizable with today's times. Although the Dutch managed to maintain their grip on their colonies in Asia and the Americas into the 20th century, the 18th century saw them descend the global power rankings almost as quickly as they had risen. And when Napoleon installed his brother Louis Bonaparte as King of Holland in 1806, there could be no more pretense to global Dutch power. It was over. Hitler would remind them of this some 130 years later, when he invaded the Netherlands in World War II and governed until 1945.
On May 9th, Hitler invaded Holland and Belgium. These nations too hoped to avert war. And these nations too minded their own business and spoke softly. But Hitler struck at them, again without warning, because he had decided the Battle of France could best be won by outflanking the Maginot Line. He had no quarrel with these nations. They were merely convenient roads to France. Simultaneously, the Nazis smashed across Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. To the now familiar recipe of the Blitz were added parachute troops who swarmed down upon Dutch cities and airfields and further disrupted a hopeless defense. Men had discussed, and most armies had experimented with this new dimension in mobile warfare, but the Nazis were the first to use parachutists in force. Guns and ammunition sailed down in special parachutes and were assembled quickly on the ground. Thus, the Nazis could capture and destroy airfields, railroad stations, and other strategic points back of the defenders' lines. Using tanks, dive bombers, big guns, the Nazi machine broke the back of Dutch resistance in 4 days.
After World War II, Netherlands began to take on the liberal reputation I had mentioned earlier. The city of Amsterdam has now become a premier tourist destination in Europe and still holds the commercial appeal it got all those years ago through its colonial trading posts. As a founding and current member of NATO and the European Union, it's hard to see any external major disturbances to the city materializing. So Amsterdam is in a global safe zone. But any student of history knows that nothing man-made is certain. Global debt levels are now at all-time highs. Russia and Ukraine have plunged Europe into its largest war since World War II. And with growing cracks in Eurocentric oneness becoming the latest political fad during peacetime, it's not hard to see how an economic crisis, similar to 2008, will ruin this golden age of peace for Amsterdam. After all, the cause and effect of both world wars so far have largely been triggered in the European theater.